Welcome to the series I'm calling Sciencing, intended to help you to better understand scientific research whenever you come across it. This module is going to introduce you to longitudinal cohort studies, a type of observational study. See the module on Introduction to Quantitative Research Methods if the meaning of observational in the context of research is unclear. Longitudinal cohort studies are sometimes also referred to as epidemiological studies. Epidemiology is the study of diseases and populations, although sometimes we use the same methods to study things other than disease. So sometimes these terms are used interchangeably. This study design can be prospective, which basically means looking forward, and I'll give concrete examples of that, or retrospective, which means looking back. And I'll also expand on that. Longitudinal studies often address questions about what exposures. So for example, let me take a step back. The exposure is determined by the researchers. What are they interested in looking at? So perhaps that is smoking, or that is obesity, or that is physical activity or exercise, some aspect thereof. It could be dietary habits. It could be education. We're looking to see if these are mathematically associated with specific outcomes. Now, in contrast to case control studies, here we can look at multiple exposures and multiple outcomes. We can also determine the incidence of disease. So at what rate, at what pace does a given disease arise? Cross-sectional, if you've watched that, I would have said it's very good at assessing prevalence. How many people have the condition right now? But incidence is going to tell us, is it on the rise? Is it decreasing? What can we reasonably predict about the near future? It's useful to know that researchers assign the exposure. Important to actually repeat that. And they decide on what outcomes they want to look at. So in one study, we'll call it study 1, this study may have obesity as the exposure and heart attacks as the outcome of interest. Whereas another study, call it study 2, may have obesity as the outcome and diet, or some aspect of diet, as the exposure. So you cannot simply say smoking is an exposure. It could be an outcome. You could even have a given condition as the exposure. It depends on what questions the researchers are asking. But there will always be exposures, at least one of interest, and outcome, at least one of interest. Okay, so what's meant by the word cohort? We've covered exposure and outcome. What is meant by cohort? Well, a cohort is a group of people who share a common characteristic or experience within a defined period of time. Let's look at concrete examples. That's always best. One type of cohort study is a birth cohort. So some New Zealand examples include the Pacific Island Family Study, in which the cohort is made up of Pacific Island children born at Middlemore Hospital in Auckland between March and December 2000. And I believe the study also includes their whānau, their family, at least brothers, sisters, and parents, for example, or guardians. Another example of such a birth cohort study is the Dunedin Multidisciplinary Health and Development Study, which is comprised of Dunedin children born in April, or rather between April 1972 and March 1973. So this was even the basis of a documentary, I think, called How Am I? Then we have cohorts based on profession. For example, the Nurses' Health Studies, which we already have Nurses' Health Study 1, 2 and are now working on 3. So the commonality there, what defines the cohort, is nurses, and I believe exclusively in the United States of America. From the UK, we have the Whitehall 2 study. This includes British civil servants. So here the cohort is defined primarily by profession, and there are numerous other examples. Or a cohort might be defined by a geographic region, in which case a cohort might be open. What does that mean? An open cohort, or the term, simply means that individual people might enter or leave the cohort at different time points. Because here it's not about the people so much, or at least that isn't what defines the cohort. The region defines the cohort. Most of the time, though, it is the people. And that's when we get a closed cohort. This enrolls people at the start of the study and then follows them over a period of time that can potentially be quite lengthy. Now, some people might be what we call lost to follow-up, meaning they stop providing information for whatever reasons. They withdraw their consent to participate. They can no longer be contacted because maybe they've moved away, or people also die. So there are various reasons. And these people will not be replaced, and no new people will be added to this kind of cohort study. The word longitudinal tells us that data is collected at multiple time points from the same people. So this contrasts with a cross-sectional approach. A prospective longitudinal cohort study recruits people and starts to collect data. Data are then collected from the cohort, usually at regular intervals, until the study ends or the participant is lost to follow-up. In a retrospective study, things work in the opposite way. Researchers decide to investigate something at time point 0, let's say now, and then they look back by using records or stored samples, for example. The advantages of the prospective approach include that these studies collect the desired information. They decide, the researchers decide what is wanted, and providing they get sufficient funding and have the other technical resources required, they can collect exactly that information. Unlike retrospective studies that rely on information that's already been collected, or samples that have already been collected. Prospective studies provide the true incidence of conditions and exposures. That's something we can't get really from other designs. And they allow the assessment of multiple conditions and multiple exposures, again, unlike case control studies. They may uncover novel associations. That is less common in the other observational study designs because of the very specific questions being asked and how the analysis is done. Now, it's important to remember, even with prospective cohort studies, that, once again, correlation does not mean causation. Even if there is a strong correlation, so a high number, let's say 0.9, 1 being the best correlation possible, 0.9 is very high, even if that is still significant, it may mean, well, once again, that the exposure and the condition are related, and that the exposure causes the condition of interest. That is a possibility, but the cohort study cannot confirm that. We cannot be confident of it. It may be that the condition of interest causes the exposure, in fact. People with a specific condition take on a certain habit. Maybe less healthy people are more inclined to take multivitamins. And then we find, well, okay, multivitamin use might be related to poor health, but that's possibly because people already with poor health were more inclined to start taking them. For example, I'm not saying that's the case. Now, another very realistic possibility is that there is some other factor that correlates with the condition of interest and correlates with the exposure, but the actual condition of interest or the outcome and the exposure aren't in any causal way linked. There is just an additional factor that they have in common. Sometimes even prospective studies depend on the ability of people to accurately remember the recent past, for example, what they had been eating over the past year. Imperfect recall is therefore a limitation. For example, people with dementia might have worse recall than those without dementia. Or people with lung cancer might incorrectly recall smoking more than those without lung cancer. Rare outcomes are also a problem, as studying these using cohort studies would demand very large sample sizes to ensure the cohort contained many people who get those rare outcomes. And that would make the study extremely expensive to run. The long duration of a longitudinal cohort study is a strength, but it's also a limitation. It might take many years before an association between an exposure and an outcome are identified. Consider that many of the very problematic diseases affecting us these days are things like cancer, like dementia, like cardiovascular disease that can take years or even decades to develop. There is also something called attrition bias, and this occurs when certain people, for example, those with outcomes of interest, such as a specific disease, are more likely to pull out of a study than those without that outcome, without that condition. That can skew the results. So, in other words, that can give us different results than had everyone stayed in. Another problem is that the best methods of data collection tend to change over time. But the results generated by the new method might not be easy to compare to those generated by an older method. So there is always the problem of, do we use the best method available, or do we stick with an older method so we can more easily compare what is happening over time? Moving on to retrospective longitudinal cohort studies. These have some advantages too. They are fast, as it's not necessary to wait for years to get the data of interest. As they often rely on records, medical records, for example, the main cost is the time of the researchers. And this makes them relatively inexpensive. Retrospective cohort studies are also good at assessing multiple outcomes, so unlike, say, case control studies, and they are suited to addressing rarer outcomes better than our prospective cohort studies, as a large sample size in retrospective cohort studies comes with less expense. We're not really recruiting people here, we're looking at records. In a retrospective study, the exact data by the researchers can be collected and the accuracy of that data can be verified. Whereas in a retrospective study, we rely on data contained in existing records, for example, medical records, or what people are able to recall. The limitations of the retrospective studies therefore include imperfect recall, and if a study relies mostly or exclusively on records, the limitation becomes the accuracy and completeness of those records. Records are prone to missing data, and even if the data are available, they may not be accurate and it may not be complete. They may also not contain everything researchers would want to know. The temporal relationship, did A come before B or vice versa, can also be less clear with a retrospective study than it would be with a prospective study. Lastly, if we're looking at rare diseases, a very large sample size will still be needed. If you found this useful, hit like, hit subscribe, and most importantly, keep watching to learn about research, other research types in other modules, possibly one here or here.